At an art auction, a group of wealthy patrons laughs as a black maid begins painting, expecting a disaster. When they see her finished masterpiece, they fall silent, stunned by her talent, realizing their prejudices have blinded them. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The chandeliers cast a golden glow across the marble floors of Alexander Morrison's mansion, where New York's elite gather for the season's most anticipated art auction. The grand foyer buzzed with conversations about million-dollar paintings and emerging artists, while waiters in pressed black uniforms weaved through the crowd with champagne flutes balanced on silver trays. Beatrice Lancaster stood near the entrance, her designer dress catching the light as she surveyed the room with practiced casualness. Her reputation as a shrewd art collector preceded her, and she'd already marked 3 pieces in the auction catalog that would complement her extensive collection. Next to her, Evelyn Rhodes adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she developed over years of competing for social status. "Did you see the Rothko they're featuring tonight?" Beatrice asked, not looking up from her catalog. "I heard the bidding will start at $12 million. Evelyn's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her champagne glass. 12? That's rather modest considering the market. I'm more interested in the emerging artists section. There's a fascinating new abstract expressionist from Berlin." Their conversation was interrupted by Charles Winston's arrival. He moved through the crowd like he owned it, his expensive suit and contemptuous smile serving as armor against those he considered beneath him. Charles had made his fortune in tech startups, but his real passion was wielding his wealth as a weapon in the art world. "Ladies," he said, approaching them with an affected drawl, "I see we're all hunting for treasures tonight." He glanced at a young couple examining a sculpture nearby. "Though I must say, they're letting anyone in these days. Those two wouldn't know a Picasso from a preschooler's finger painting." Beatrice offered a polite laugh, while Evelyn nodded in agreement. The social hierarchy in these events was clear, and they all played their parts perfectly. The crowd's attention shifted as movement near the service entrance caught their eye. A young black woman in simple clothing was setting up an easel in the corner. She moved with purpose, laying out brushes and paints with careful precision. Most guests simply looked past her, assuming she was part of the cleaning staff. "Is this some kind of performance art?" Charles asked loudly, earning several snickers from nearby guests. "Or did someone forget to check credentials at the door?" The woman, Aisha, continued her setup, her face betraying no reaction to the comments floating around her. Her movements were deliberate, professional, showing a familiarity with her tools that went unnoticed by most of the gathering. The atmosphere shifted when Harrison Wells, the auctioneer, stepped onto the small platform at the front of the room. He was known for his ability to drive up bids with just a raised eyebrow, but tonight there was something different in his demeanor. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Before we begin our scheduled auction, we have a special presentation. Please welcome Aisha Johnson, who will be creating an original piece this evening." The announcement was met with uncomfortable silence, followed by whispers and exchanged glances. Charles didn't bother lowering his voice as he said, "Is this some kind of joke? We're here for serious acquisitions, not amateur hour." Beatrice and Evelyn exchanged knowing looks, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disdain. The other guests began to cluster in small groups, their murmured conversations a buzz of disbelief and judgment. Aisha stood at her easel, her posture straight and confident despite the wave of skepticism washing over her. She picked up her brush with steady hands, seemingly oblivious to the incredulous stares and barely concealed sneers around her. The stage was set for a confrontation between two worlds, the established elite of the art world and an outsider who dared to claim space in their carefully guarded domain. As Aisha lifted her brush to the canvas, the room's atmosphere grew thick with anticipation and prejudice. Her movements were precise and confident, each stroke deliberate as she began laying down the foundation of her work. The initial lines emerged boldly, suggesting the outline of an urban landscape. Beatrice leaned closer to Evelyn, keeping her voice low but sharp. "I suppose we're all meant to stand here and pretend this is normal?" Her fingers drummed against her auction catalog, a subtle sign of her growing irritation. Evelyn's response came with a slight curl of her lip. "Darling, the help usually waits until after the event to clean up, not during." Her attempt at what earned a few chuckles from those standing nearby. But the laughter died quickly as Aisha's painting began to take shape. The canvas was coming alive with unexpected vigor. What started as simple lines transformed into a complex cityscape, but not the sanitized version seen in gallery windows. Aisha's city pulsed with raw energy. Fire escapes zigzagged across buildings like steel veins. Windows reflected both light and shadow, and the streets seemed to breathe with untold stories. Walter Chun, the evening's featured art critic, stood slightly apart from the other guests. His reputation for brutal honesty had earned him both respect and fear in the art world. He watched Aisha's progress with narrowed eyes, his usual expression of bored disdain slowly shifting to something more complex. The painting continued to evolve. Aisha's brush moved with increasing confidence, adding layers of color that somehow managed to capture both the grit and grace of urban life. The buildings in her piece weren't mere structures. They were witnesses to human struggle and triumph, their walls holding secrets that seemed to seep through the paint itself. "Interesting technique," Walter muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His trained eye caught the subtle ways Aisha manipulated light and shadow, creating depth that shouldn't have been possible with such seemingly simple strokes. Despite his professional skepticism, he found himself taking a step closer. The other guests' reactions began to splinter. Some maintained their initial dismissiveness, making a show of checking their phones or whispering behind raised hands. Others, however, couldn't help but be drawn in by the emerging artwork. The painting demanded attention, not through shock or gimmicks, but through its undeniable authenticity. Beatrice's carefully maintained expression of disinterest cracked slightly as she watched a particular detail emerge. A small group of children playing double dutch between the buildings, their forms suggested rather than detailed, yet somehow capturing perfectly the movement and joy of the moment. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, her usual social confidence wavering. The vibrancy of the scene before them was making her own carefully curated collection of acceptable art seem suddenly hollow. She glanced around, seeking reassurance in others' reactions, but found only conflicted expressions. Walter had moved even closer now, his critical eye catching every nuance of Aisha's technique. Her brushwork was unconventional, breaking several rules of classical painting, yet achieving effects that spoke to something deeper than mere technical skill. He found himself puzzling over how she managed to capture not just the physical reality of the city, but its soul. The painting was now roughly half complete, and the energy in the room had shifted palpably. The initial murmurs of disbelief and derision had given way to an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the soft sounds of brush against canvas. Even those who wanted to dismiss the work found themselves unable to look away. The city in Aisha's painting wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense, yet it possessed an undeniable power. The contrast between the harsh realities she depicted and the underlying hope woven through every brushstroke created a tension that resonated with something raw and real, something that the polished facades of the mansion's occupants couldn't quite ignore. Walter's expression had transformed from skepticism to intense concentration. His reputation had been built on identifying true talent, regardless of its source, and what he was witnessing was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The technical skill was evident, yes, but there was something more, something that couldn't be taught in any art school or bought with any amount of money. Charles Winston's face had grown increasingly red as he watched the growing interest in Aisha's work. He moved through the crowd with deliberate steps, positioning himself where his voice would carry. "Well, isn't this charming? We've all become so progressive, haven't we?" Standing here watching the help finger paint. His words fell flat in the charged atmosphere. Several guests who might have laughed earlier now looked away uncomfortably. The painting had progressed to reveal more of its complex narrative, a story of urban life that couldn't be dismissed with cheap jokes. Aisha continued working, her brush moving with unwavering focus. Each stroke added depth to the cityscape, revealing layers of life within the concrete and steel. Fire escapes became gathering places, broken windows reflected dreams, and graffiti transformed into poetry. The technical skill was undeniable, but it was the raw truth in her work that made it impossible to ignore. "This is absolutely absurd," Charles persisted, his voice rising with frustration at being ignored. "I didn't come here to watch some diversity higher play at being an artist. There are standards in this world." Walterchin stepped away from his observation post, his critical "I never" leaving the canvas. He moved closer to Aisha, studying the way she layered colors to create depth. His presence near her workspace sent a ripple through the crowd. Walter's opinion could make or break careers in the art world. The critic's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed intense interest. He watched as Aisha captured the essence of community life in the margins of her urban landscape. Laundry lines connecting buildings like prayer flags, children playing in fire hydrant spray, elderly men playing chess on milk crates. "Notice how she uses light." Walter spoke quietly, but in the tense atmosphere, his words carried the interplay between shadow and hope. "This isn't mere representation, it's truth on canvas." Charles scoffed loudly. "Truth? Please. This is nothing but pandering to current sensibilities. Real art requires training, tradition, understanding of the masters. Real art," Walter cut in, his voice sharp, "requires the courage to see and show the world as it is, not as we pretend it to be." He moved closer to the canvas, pointing to specific details. "Look at the texture in these brick walls, the way they hold both decay and dignity. This isn't just technique, it's lived experience transformed into visual poetry." The critic's words hung in the air, forcing the gathered elite to confront their own assumptions. Some shifted uncomfortably, others stepped closer to see what Walter was pointing out. The painting had become impossible to dismiss as mere novelty. Aisha worked steadily through this exchange, each brush stroke adding to the growing power of her piece. The city in her painting wasn't just buildings and streets. It was a living organism, breathing with the collective experiences of its inhabitants. Walter found himself questioning his own preconceptions about art and authenticity. His career had been built on understanding the established rules of the art world, but standing before Aisha's canvas, those rules suddenly seemed inadequate. The raw honesty in her work challenged everything he thought he knew about what made art valuable. "Tell me," he finally addressed Aisha directly, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than condescension. "What drove you to capture this particular perspective? These moments of life between the shadows?" The room held its breath, many hearing Aisha's voice for the first time that evening. The distance between the world of the elite gallery and the reality depicted on her canvas seemed to stretch and contract in that moment of anticipation. Charles's attempt to maintain control of the narrative had backfired, drawing even more attention to the undeniable power of Aisha's work. The usual social dynamics of these events had been disrupted, forcing everyone present to confront not just the art, but their own reactions to it. The painting continued to evolve, each new detail adding to its impact. What had started as an unwelcome interruption to their evening had become an unavoidable confrontation with truth, talent, and their own prejudices. Aisha paused her brushwork, meeting Walter's gaze with quiet dignity. "I paint what I see," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Beauty exists everywhere, even in places people choose not to look." She gestured to a detail in her painting, a broken window with a flourishing plant growing through the cracks. Life finds a way to thrive, even in forgotten spaces. The simplicity and power of her words created a palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. Walter nodded slowly, his professional facade cracking to reveal genuine interest. "Tell me more about your background," he said, ignoring the disapproving murmurs from some of the guests. "I've been painting since I could hold a brush," Aisha replied, adding subtle shadows to a fire escape where children played. "I clean houses during the day, including this mansion. But at night, I paint what I see in the city, the real city, not just the parts people want to see. Beatrice stepped forward, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "This is all very touching," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "But surely we should return to the actual auction. There are serious pieces to be considered." The growing tension was interrupted by scattered whispers as guests noticed tears forming in Walter's eyes. The hardened critic, known for his merciless reviews, stood transfixed before the painting. "Do you see this?" he asked, pointing to a particular section where Aisha had captured an elderly woman tending to a rooftop garden. "This is more than technique. This is truth." The silence that followed was deafening. Aisha continued painting, adding layers of depth to her urban landscape. Each brushstroke seemed to challenge the artificial barriers between high art and lived experience. "I've spent decades critiquing art," Walter continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen thousands of paintings in the finest galleries across the world. But this," he gestured to Aisha's work, "this is what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to make us feel something real." The other guests shifted uncomfortably. Some moved closer to examine the details Walter had pointed out, while others maintained their distance, clinging to their preconceptions. The painting had become a mirror, reflecting back their own biases and assumptions. Beatrice attempted once more to regain control of the situation. "While this is interesting," she began, but her words trailed off as she found herself drawn into the detail of a young girl jumping rope, her face a perfect capture of pure joy amid urban decay. The painting was nearly complete now, and even those who had initially scoffed couldn't deny its impact. Aisha had created more than just an image. She had captured a truth about life, struggle, and beauty that transcended social barriers. Walter stood silently for a moment, then spoke again, his critical voice replaced by something more vulnerable. "Where did you learn to paint like this?" "Life taught me," Aisha answered, her brush never stopping. "Every building I clean, every person I pass on the street, every sunrise over the projects, they all taught me to see beauty in unexpected places." The tension in the room had transformed from dismissive hostility to something more complex. The gathered elite found themselves confronted not just by talent they couldn't dismiss, but by their own assumptions about where art and beauty could come from. As Aisha worked on the final details of her painting, the distinction between servant and artist, between high culture and street life, began to blur. Her canvas had become a window into a world many present had chosen not to see, forcing them to confront both its beauty and their own blindness. The Laloero stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. The usual protocol for art evaluation seemed inadequate for this moment. The room's atmosphere had grown heavy with unspoken thoughts and shifting perspectives. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we should now evaluate Ms. Johnson's work." His voice carried less of its usual authority, as if he too sensed the traditional metrics of value were being challenged. Aisha's painting now commanded the room. The cityscape she'd created pulsed with life. Laundry lines strung between buildings like festival banners, children playing in fire hydrant spray, elderly couples sitting on stoops, young artists painting murals on walls. But it was more than just scenes of city life. It was a testament to the dignity and beauty in everyday existence. Evelyn Rhodes, who had built her reputation on spotting the next big thing in art, found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about value. Her carefully curated collection of important works suddenly seemed hollow compared to the raw authenticity before her. "The technique is," Evelyn began, then stopped, struggling to maintain her usual authoritative tone. "It's unlike anything I've seen." She moved closer to examine a particular section where Aisha had captured the reflection of sunset in a broken window, somehow making it more beautiful for being broken. The painting featured no famous landmarks or recognizable skylines. Instead, it captured the essence of urban life. The struggles, the triumphs, the everyday moments of grace that most of the gathered elite had trained themselves not to see. The typical markers of artistic value, famous signatures, prestigious gallery provenances, auction house records, seemed suddenly meaningless. The gathered crowd had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. The usual chatter about price points and investment potential was notably absent. Instead, they found themselves confronting questions about what truly makes art valuable. Aisha added the final touches to her work, each brushstroke deliberate and confident. The completed painting seemed to breathe with its own life, challenging everyone present to see the world differently. The use of light. One guest began, trying to fall back on familiar art world jargon, but the words felt inadequate. The painting wasn't just about technique or style, it was about truth. Charles shifted uneasily, his earlier bravado diminishing in the face of undeniable talent. His expensive watch caught the light as he checked the time, a nervous gesture that betrayed his discomfort. Around the room, other guests were having similar moments of reflection. The usual social hierarchies and pretenses began to feel brittle and artificial compared to the authentic power of Aisha's work. Walter had remained silent for several minutes, his critics taking in every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual. El cynicisme. We're not just looking at a painting, he said quietly. We're looking at ourselves and what we choose not to see. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she reached for another glass of champagne. Her carefully constructed identity as an art world tastemaker felt suddenly precarious. The painting before her couldn't be dismissed with clever criticism or social maneuvering. The room had become uncomfortably warm, or perhaps it was just the heat of recognition. The understanding that true art doesn't always come wrapped in the right pedigree or bearing the right credentials. As the final moments of evaluation approached, each person present seemed lost in their own thoughts, confronting not just the painting before them, but their own assumptions about art, value, and who gets to decide what matters. The usual metrics of artistic worth, gallery representation, auction records, critical acclaim, seemed to dissolve in the face of something more fundamental: the ability of art to reveal truth and challenge perception. Walter Chin cleared his throat, breaking the weighted silence. What we're witnessing here, he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in the art world, is not just talent. It's a mirror being held up to our own prejudices. The room stirred uncomfortably. Several guests shifted their weight, avoiding eye contact with both the painting and each other. The usual social choreography of these events had been completely disrupted. This is absurd, Charles interjected, his voice sharp with defensive anger. We're not here for social commentary. This is an auction, not a charity event. His words hung in the air, heavy with implications that made even his usual supporters wince. Walter turned to face him directly. Tell me, Mr. Winston, what exactly makes art valuable? The price tag? The artist's pedigree? Or perhaps its ability to move us, to make us see the world differently? His tone was measured but carried an edge of challenge. The gathered crowd began to split into factions. Some guests moved closer to Charles, clinging to familiar hierarchies, while others drifted toward the painting, drawn by its undeniable power. Beatrice stood somewhere in between, her social instincts warring with her aesthetic judgment. I've spent my entire career evaluating art, Walter continued, addressing the room at large. I've praised works worth millions and dismissed others because they didn't fit our narrow definition of value. But standing here tonight, I have to ask, what have we been missing? A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others scoffed. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. This is about more than just one painting, Walter pressed on. It's about who gets to decide what art matters, who gets to tell stories, who gets to be seen. Beatrice stepped forward, attempting to mediate. Perhaps we could discuss this more appropriately at another time. But her words lacked conviction, and she trailed off as she caught sight of a detail in the painting she hadn't noticed before, a reflection of the city's soul that made her own carefully curated collection seem suddenly superficial. The debate intensified. Voices rose and fell, some defending traditional values, others questioning long-held assumptions. The painting stood among them like a silent witness, its truth undimmed by the controversy surrounding it. Quality speaks for itself, one guest argued. Background shouldn't matter. Then why did we all react the way we did when she first began? Walter countered. Why did we assume she didn't belong here? Charles's face had grown increasingly red. This is exactly what's wrong with the art world today. Everything has to be about social justice. What happened to art for art's sake? Art has never been just for art's sake, Walter responded, his voice cutting through the noise. It's always been about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and who gets to eat. LL the story. The argument had moved beyond aesthetics in a territory that made many guests visibly uncomfortable. Questions of class, race, and privilege hung in the air, impossible to ignore in the face of Aisha's work. Beatrice made another attempt to restore order, but her practiced social grace seemed inadequate for the moment. The usual rules of engagement had been shattered, leaving raw truth exposed beneath the polite veneer of high society. Walter stood his ground, his reputation adding weight to his words. Look at that painting, really look at it. Then tell me honestly that your first reaction wasn't colored by who you thought the artist was, rather than what she created. The room crackled with tension as his words forced each person present to confront their own initial prejudices and assumptions. The comfortable barriers between art world insider and outsider had been irreparably breached. The luxurious auction room had transformed into an impromptu forum, with the painting serving as both catalyst and witness to the unfolding drama. The usual social boundaries blurred as heated discussions erupted throughout the space. This isn't what we came here for, Charles announced, attempting to rally support. We're here to acquire established works, not engage in social experiments. His voice carried an edge of desperation, as if he could feel his influence slipping. Aisha stood quietly beside her work, her presence a stark contrast to the chaos around her. The painting spoke volumes, its depiction of urban life revealing truths that no amount of social maneuvering could dismiss. Actually, a voice cut through the clamor. It was Margaret Chun, Walter's wife and a prominent gallery owner. This is exactly what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to make us uncomfortable, make us think, make us question. Charles attempted to redirect attention to his own recent acquisitions. I just purchased a Basquiat last month but his words trailed off as several guests turned away, more interested in examining details of Aisha's work. The painting had become a Rorschach test for the gathered elite. Some saw in it a threat to their carefully constructed world of artistic valuation. Others recognized a truth they'd long ignored. The usual metrics of artistic worth, price points, gallery representation, auction records, seemed increasingly hollow. The technique alone. One of the established artists present began studying the brushwork closely. This isn't amateur work. This is mastery. Aisha finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Art isn't about technique alone. It's about truth, about seeing what others choose to ignore. She gestured to a section of her painting showing children playing amid urban decay. Beauty exists everywhere if we're willing to look. Her words cut through the pretense, forcing many present to confront their own biases. Several guests who had initially dismissed her now couldn't meet her eyes. Do you know what I see when I clean these houses? Aisha continued, surprising everyone with her directness. I see beautiful art hanging on walls, art that speaks of struggle and hope. But it's all sanitized safe. The real struggle, the real hope that exists outside these walls. The room fell silent. Even Charles seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Walter stepped forward again. We've created a system that values provenance over power, pedigree over truth. Maybe it's time to question that system. The debate intensified. Some guests argued for maintaining traditional standards, while others began questioning everything they'd previously accepted about artistic value. But where do we draw the line? Someone asked. If we abandon our standards? Our standards? Aisha interrupted, her quiet voice somehow carrying more weight than the loudest arguments. Who created these standards? Who do they serve? Who do they exclude? Her questions hung in the air, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. The paintings seemed to pulse with life, each detail challenging the artificial boundaries between high art and lived experience. Some of the younger collectors began openly discussing the transformative power of Aisha's work. Even those who had initially aligned with Charles found themselves drawn into conversations about authenticity and representation in art. The evening had veered far from its intended course. Instead of a predictable auction of acceptable works, they found themselves confronting fundamental questions about art, value, and whose stories get told. Charles made one final attempt to assert control. This is all very touching, but there's a proper way to enter the art world. There are channels, procedures. Perhaps, Walter interjected, those channels are exactly what we need to question. Let's be practical about this, a prominent collector announced, rising from his seat. We could consider this as a charitable acquisition, something to demonstrate our commitment to diversity. His attempt at diplomacy only highlighted the underlying prejudice. The suggestion landed like a slap. Aisha's expression remained composed, but her eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and determination. The painting behind her seemed to grow more powerful, its images of urban life and dignity standing in stark rebuke to the collector's condescension. Walter stepped forward, his usual professional reserve cracking. "I need to say something." His voice trembled slightly, surprising those who knew him as the ruthless critic. "For 30 years, I've been the gatekeeper, deciding whose art matters and whose doesn't. I've rejected countless artists because they didn't fit our predetermined mold." The room grew still. Walter rarely spoke about himself, and never with such raw honesty. "I was an artist once," he continued, his words heavy with regret. "A real one, not just a critic, but I let them convince me that my voice, my perspective as an Asian American, was too specific, not universal enough." He laughed bitterly. "So I learned to judge art by their rules instead of creating it by my own." His confession hung in the air, adding another layer of complexity to the evening's upheaval. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own complicity in similar stories. "The difference is," Walter said, turning to Aisha, "you didn't let them stop you. Your work isn't asking for permission to exist. It simply exists with a truth that makes our carefully constructed standards look like what they are, barriers designed to keep certain voices out." Aisha studied him for a moment, then spoke with quiet authority. "The art world doesn't need more gatekeepers, Mr. Chen. It needs more open doors." She gestured to her painting. "I'd be honored to have you paint again, to mentor me, as I could mentor you in seeing the world through fresh eyes." The unexpectedness of her offer, the employee offering to mentor the established critic, created another ripple through the room. Charles scoffed audibly, but others watched with growing interest. "Absolutely absurd," someone muttered. "She can't seriously be offering to mentor Walter Chun." But Walter was already moving toward the painting supplies Aisha had brought, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a brush. "I haven't held one of these in 20 years, he admitted. "Sometimes," Aisha responded, "we need to relearn what we thought we knew." She guided his hand toward her palette. "Art isn't about rules or status. It's about truth. Your truth is just as valid as anyone else's." The gathered elite watched in stunned silence as Walter Chen, the feared critic who could make or break careers with a single review, tentatively began to paint alongside Aisha. His initial strokes were hesitant, but under her gentle guidance, they grew more confident. This role reversal, the critic becoming student, the employee becoming teacher, challenged the social hierarchy more profoundly. Why than any argument could have. It demonstrated in real time how arbitrary their notions of authority and expertise really were. Charles watched with barely concealed horror as his carefully maintained world of artistic valuation continued to unravel. But others began to see something else. The possibility of an art world based on authentic expression rather than social positioning. The evening had transcended the original conflict. It was no longer just about one painter challenging the status quo, but about fundamental questions of who gets to create, who gets to teach, and who gets to decide what matters in art. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from hostility to something more complex. Beatrice, who had been watching the interactions between Walter and Aisha intently, finally moved away from her usual social circle. Her carefully maintained facade showed cracks of genuine emotion. "I've spent decades collecting what I was told was important," she said, more to herself than anyone else. But when was the last time a piece of art made me feel something real? She turned to study the details of Aisha's painting. The mother braiding her daughter's hair on a fire escape, the old man playing chess with neighborhood kids, the community garden growing between concrete blocks. Evelyn, standing nearby, removed her designer glasses and wiped her eyes. "I've been calling myself a visionary," she admitted, "but I've only been looking where I was told to look." Her voice carried the weight of recognition. How many artists like Aisha have I walked past without seeing? The transformation happening in the room was palpable. The usual competition for status and social positioning had given way to something more authentic. Even those who had initially sided with Charles found themselves drawn into conversations about art's true purpose. Walter continued to paint under Aisha's guidance, his technical skill evident but rusty. She showed him how to capture light reflecting off broken windows, how to find beauty in decay, how to tell stories through simple brushstrokes. His hand grew steadier with each movement. "You see," Aisha explained, not just to Walter, but to everyone listening, art isn't about perfection. It's about honesty, about seeing what's really there, not what we pretend to see. She guided his brush toward a shadowy corner of their shared canvas. Even darkness has its own kind of light. Beatrice approached them hesitantly. "I have connections," she offered, her voice lacking its usual artificial polish. "Galleries, collectors, if you're interested." She paused, then added with unexpected humility, "Though perhaps we need your perspective more than you need our platforms." Evelyn joined them, her social mask completely dropped. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," she said. "Not for charity." She glanced apologetically at Aisha, "but for truth. For artists who see what we've been trained not to see." The room had become a space of transformation. The usual barriers of class and status had been temporarily dissolved by the power of authentic art and honest conversation. Even those who maintained their skepticism couldn't deny the energy in the room. Small groups formed and reformed as people engaged in genuine dialogue about art, privilege, and perspective. The usual networking and social maneuvering had been replaced by something more meaningful. "Perhaps," Evelyn mused, watching Walter and Aisha work together, "this is what the art world was supposed to be all along. Not a closed circle, but an open conversation." Beatrice nodded, her usual competitive edge softened by reflection. "We've been so busy proving we belong that we forgot to question who we were keeping out." The evening had moved beyond its initial conflict into something more profound, a reimagining of what art could be when stripped of artificial barriers and pretense. The gathered elite, or at least some of them, began to see possibility. Yes, they had never considered before. The change wasn't universal. Some guests maintained their distance, clinging to familiar hierarchies. But others found themselves drawn into new ways of seeing, not just art, but their own roles in shaping cultural value. As the night progressed, plans began to form. Not the usual schemes for investment and social advancement, but genuine ideas about how to open doors that had long been closed. The energy in the room had shifted from resistance to possibility. The double doors of the auction room burst open with dramatic timing. Marcus Sterling, the infamous art collector known for his brutal business tactics and billion-dollar collection, strode in with the confidence of someone used to owning every room he entered. His perfectly tailored suit and cold smile created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The conversation stopped. Even Charles straightened his posture, recognizing a more dominant player in the art world's hierarchy. Sterling's reputation for discovering artists and effectively owning their entire output preceded him. "Don't let me interrupt," Sterling said, his voice carrying false warmth. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the unusual scene. Walter Chin painting alongside a Maid, the elite of New York's art world gathered in uncharacteristically genuine conversation. Finally, his gaze settled on Aisha's painting. For a moment, even he seemed struck silent by its power. Then his businessman's mind began calculating. "Remarkable," he said, moving closer. "Simply remarkable. Ms. Johnson, is it? We should talk." He pulled out his checkbook with practiced flourish. "I'll be direct. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous sum for this piece, and a contract for exclusive rights to your future work." You'll have a show at the Sterling Gallery within a month. Your life will change overnight. The room held its breath. This was the moment when dreams usually came true, when struggling artists were discovered and welcomed into the prestigious world of high art. The amount Sterling wrote on the check would have funded a lifetime of artistic freedom. Aisha studied the check, then looked back at her painting. In it, a group of children played double dutch while their grandmother watched from a window above, the scene capturing both struggle and joy, community and resilience. "Mr. Sterling," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, "this painting isn't for sale." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sterling's smile flickered but didn't fade. "My dear, perhaps you don't understand the opportunity." "I understand perfectly," Aisha interrupted, surprising everyone with her directness. "You want to buy not just my work but my voice, to package and sell it in a way that makes it safe for this world." She gestured around the opulent room. "But my art isn't about being safe. It's about being true." Sterling's expression hardened. "Everything has a price." "No," Aisha said simply. "Some things don't. This painting belongs in the community center where I teach art to kids who've never been in a museum. They need to see that their stories matter, that their lives are worthy of being art." Walter stepped forward, still holding his paintbrush. "She's right. Art isn't just a commodity to be bought and sold. Sometimes it's a mirror showing us what we need to see." Sterling's mask of benevolence cracked. "This is business. Art without commerce is just a hobby." "No," Aisha countered, her voice stronger now. "Art without truth is just decoration. I paint to give voice to people who aren't in this room, who never get invited to these auctions. I won't let that voice be silenced by a price tag." Her refusal hung in the air, challenging everything the room represented. Some guests looked scandalized, others inspired. Sterling stood frozen and used to rejection. The power dynamics that had governed the evening shattered completely. The painting seemed to pulse with new energy. Every brush wrote a testament to the choice between authenticity and acceptance, between truth and success as defined by others. In that moment, the gathered elite faced a mirror more revealing than any they'd encountered before. It reflected not just Aisha's truth, but their own choices, their own compromises, their own role in determining whose stories get told and how. The revolution wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, powerful, and undeniable, like truth finally breaking through layers of pretense, changing everything it touched. Sterling's check remained ensigned on the floor, as irrelevant as the social barriers that had seemed so solid just hours before.